In this lesson, we're going to look at the autonomic nervous system anatomy. Here we're going to concentrate on the differences between the autonomic and somatic nervous system, and probably spend even more time with the differences between the two divisions of the autonomic nervous system. That would be the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous systems. And then finally, we'll end with the look at the components of the visceral reflex, which are very similar to those of the somatic reflex that you learned in Bio 107. So let's first get a review of the divisions of the nervous system. You should have covered this in 107, but in case you forgot, we'll kind of run through it. So first, think the nervous system is divided into two systems, one of which is the central nervous system, which consists of the brain and spinal cord. Then there's the peripheral nervous system. The peripheral nervous system is all those nerves running out from the central nervous system, and so we can have two types of divisions within the peripheral nervous system, the sensory division and the motor division. Sensory division, of course, brings impulses from the periphery to the central nervous system, whereas the motor is the opposite, takes impulses from the central nervous system and takes it out to the periphery to cause some kind of an effect. Now, the motor division is going to be divided into the somatic nervous system and autonomic nervous system. The somatic nervous system is the one you looked at last semester in Bio 107, and it takes impulses specifically to the skeletal muscles, whereas the autonomic nervous system takes impulses from the central nervous system out to either cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, or glands. The somatic nervous system, of course, is under our voluntary control, whereas the autonomic nervous system is not. It's involuntary. Now, the autonomic nervous system we're going to divide into the two systems, the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system, and they have different anatomies and functions as well. I like to think of their division more based on their physiology, and we'll look at that in some detail for a little brief look at that in a couple slides. So let's first compare the somatic versus autonomic nervous system and look at the differences in their anatomy. As I mentioned before, both the somatic and the autonomic are motor neurons because they're part of the motor division. And as I mentioned before, the effector for the somatic nervous system is skeletal muscle, whereas the effector, that is, again, remember, effector means something that that nervous system is acting on, would be either cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, or glands. And that's the only three things the autonomic is going to be linked to: cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, or glands. The pathway, or the efferent pathway, for the somatic nervous system consists of only one neuron. You can see the cell body located within the spinal cord, and that axon of that neuron travels all the way to the effector, whatever skeletal muscle that happens to be, and it's just one neuron the whole entire length. Also notice that it is myelinated, so that it speeds up the action potential. Whereas in the efferent pathway in the autonomic nervous system is actually composed of two neurons. Those two neurons are linked together by what's called an autonomic ganglion. That is the synapse between the two neurons they're composed of. If you remember, a ganglion is simply a group of cell bodies. You saw one last semester called the dorsal root ganglion, where the cell bodies of sensory neurons are located. Here, though, we have an autonomic ganglion. So the neuron that's before the ganglion is called the preganglionic neuron. And the neuron that's found after the ganglion is called the post-ganglionic neuron, which hopefully makes sense. Also notice that the preganglionic neuron, its cell body is located in the spinal cord, and it is myelinated. Whereas the postganglionic neuron is the one that runs to the effector. In this example, they're just using the heart, the cardiac muscle of the heart, but it is unmyelinated. Then finally, last thing to look at is the neurotransmitters. In the somatic nervous system, the neurotransmitter is acetylcholine. It's always excitatory because we want the muscle to contract so we can move. Whereas the autonomic nervous system, the neurotransmitter is either acetylcholine or norepinephrine, and it's either inhibitory or excitatory depending on the action we want on that effector. Okay, now the two divisions of the autonomic nervous system are the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system. And this diagram here shows the connections of the parasympathetic to some of the organs or the sympathetic to some organs. But I want you to think of it right now, we're going to think more in terms of the functionality or the physiology differences between the two. First of all, the parasympathetic nervous system is referred to as the rest and digest system. This is the one that's active when you're a couch potato, eating potato chips. Okay, so things related, functionality related to that. It's going to stimulate salivation, for example, because you've got to chew the food up and soften it up. It's going to inhibit your heart because you're worried about digesting. You're not worried about high heart rate exercise kind of thing. Same thing with the bronchi. It's going to constrict the bronchi because it's not like you're really worried about getting tons of oxygen in there, but it's going to stimulate the digestive tract, stimulate the gallbladder to help with digestion, and it's going to help in getting rid of waste products. Whereas the sympathetic nervous system is referred to as the fight or flight nervous system. This is the one that kicks in when you're faced with a mugger. You want to either fight them or you're going to run away from them. So what happens to your body in that type of situation? Well, one, you're going to dilate your pupils because you want to really be able to see well. You're going to inhibit salivation and inhibit the digestive tract because you really don't give a crud about what you ate. You're more worried about, you want to put all of your energy, all of the blood going to the muscles to deal with this mugger. So you're going to have things like relaxing the bronchi, the air passageway, so you get plenty of oxygen into your lungs. You want to accelerate your heart rate so you can get the blood delivered out to those tissues so they get the sugar and the oxygen they need to work effectively, particularly the skeletal muscles, so you can beat the guy up. You're not particularly care about the secretions going on to get rid of waste at that time. So it's all about how your body responds to an emergency kind of situation. So notice though that we do have some dual innervation. That is, notice that both the parasympathetic and the sympathetic are linked to the same organs, both to the pupils, both to the salivary glands, heart, lungs, stomach, liver. All of these show dual innervations. Not everything has dual innervations. Sometimes only the sympathetic nervous system is linked to a particular organ or effector. In that case, things like the sweat glands, the adrenal gland, which it does picture here on the top of the kidney. Most of the blood vessels have only sympathetic innervation, so they might call that single innervation instead of dual. I don't want you to worry about when there's dual innervation versus single innervations, but just to get the idea that they do exist. So in summary, we want to think of the parasympathetic division as that rest and digest, or think of the D's in digest, like digestion and defecation and diuresis, which means urinating. Whereas the sympathetic nervous system is the fight or flight, or the E's, exercise, emergency, and excitement. So now let's look at more detail in the anatomy of the parasympathetic nervous system. First of all, the parasympathetic nervous system origin is either in cranial nerves, which you can see located up here. It's cranial nerves 3, 7, 9, and 10. Now, you learned the cranial nerves hopefully from last semester in Bio 107, so can you name what those are? Having a pause so you think about it. So let's see, number 3 is the oculomotor, number 7 is facial, number 9 is the long one called the glossopharyngeal, and finally 10 is the vagus, which they've labeled for you in this diagram. The other side of origin is the sacral spinal nerves. So way down at the opposite end of the spinal cord in the sacral region, some of the spinal nerves contain parasympathetic neurons in there. The ganglion in the parasympathetic nervous system is located in or near the effector, either in what's called terminal ganglia, which you can see where I've shown with arrows, or in intramural ganglia, which is basically right on top of the effector organ. So that means then that you've got really long preganglionic neurons and little teeny short postganglionic neurons. Okay, so very long, the preganglionic neuron synapsing here with the post, and the post is just very short. Other notes to think about is that, one, the vagus accounts for 90% of all preganglionic fibers. You can see here, look, this vagus here is connected to all of these organs. So vast majority of any parasympathetic action travels through the vagus nerve. So by default, if you don't know, put vagus for any question that says, which neuron travels to this organ? 90% of the time, maybe you'll be right. Also, it's not very highly branched. The vagus, since the vagus has 90% of it all, it's going to go to 90% of the organs that's related to the parasympathetic. So we're not going to have a lot of overall generalized effect. Instead, we get what's called a much localized effect. And you'll see that in comparison with the sympathetic, it's much different. Okay? So let's look at the sympathetic nervous system. Now, the sympathetic nervous system its anatomy is quite a bit different than the parasympathetic nervous system. First of all, the site of origin is different. In this case, now we're looking at spinal nerves T1 through L2 contain sympathetic fibers. And then the ganglia is located differently. And then here, the ganglia is located in what's called the sympathetic trunk. That's this long line of ganglia that are found adjacent to the vertebral column. Sometimes you'll hear it called the sympathetic chain ganglion. That's what I learned, so I probably will say that more often. Or the ganglia is located in what are called collateral ganglia. And the collateral ganglia are just a little farther out, but they're not anywhere near on top of the organ, which means then that the preganglionic neuron is very short and the postganglionic is very long. That's just the opposite of what we saw with the parasympathetic nervous system. A couple other notes: the sympathetic trunk ganglia extends well beyond the T1, L2, as you can see here. It extends all the way up into the cervical regions and down to the sacral regions. However, remember, the origin of those preganglionic neurons is still limited to T1 to L2. Also, it's a highly branched system, much more branched. You can see a lot more possibilities of routes you can go through the sympathetic nervous system, and that allows for much more generalized and diffused effect of the sympathetic nervous system, unlike what we saw with the parasympathetic nervous system. Now, a little bit more detail about the pathways of the pre and post ganglionic neurons in the sympathetic nervous system that allows for this highly branched nature. So we're going to look first, let's see where the preganglionic neuron's going. Notice it's in green here. This green shows the preganglionic neuron. The red is the postganglionic neuron in this diagram. So the preganglionic neuron cell body is in the within the spinal cord. The axon then leaves the ventral root, travels through the spinal nerve, and then leaves the spinal nerve in what's called the white ramus. And from the white ramus, it enters the trunk ganglion. Now, different possibilities. One, the preganglionic neuron can then synapse with the postganglionic neuron at that level right here, and then the postganglionic neuron travels through a region here called the gray ramus, and then continues in the spinal nerve out to whatever effector it is going to. Or it could synapse at another level. So here the preganglionic neuron travels through the white ramus, and instead of synapsing at this ganglion, notice it could go up to another ganglion and even go up to a higher one, or it could go down to one lower or even farther down. So it can travel either up the ganglia, the chain ganglia, or down the chain ganglia, and then synapse with a neuron with the postganglionic neuron at another sympathetic ganglion. And then again, that postganglionic neuron is going to travel through the gray ramus, out the spinal nerve at that level, and then off to its effector. The last possibility is the preganglionic neuron could travel through the spinal nerve, the white ramus, bypass the ganglion. Notice it's not synapsing at the ganglion. Exit out that through what's called the splanchnic nerve, and synapse with the postganglionic neuron at a collateral ganglion. And then the postganglionic neuron travels off to the effector, whatever organ or gland that is. Okay? So those are the possibilities for travel. And again, so just again to go through it, we've got the preganglionic neuron traveling the spinal nerve, the white ramus synapsing at the same level with the postganglionic neuron, or synapsing at a lower or higher level with the postganglionic neuron, or synapsing at the collateral ganglia. Okay? Now, white ramus and gray ramus, lovely anatomical terms. Think white ramus because remember the preganglionic neuron is myelinated, so myelinated tissue has a white appearance to it, hence white ramus. Postganglionic neurons are not myelinated, so gray. So they have a gray appearance in color, so that's the gray ramus. And that hopefully will help you keep those two separate. All right, now there is one exception to this lovely route, and that's the connection of the sympathetic neuron to the adrenal medulla. Now the adrenal medulla is a gland located above the kidney here. It actually, I want you to think of it as two glands in one. You've got the adrenal medulla, which is the middle, medulla middle, and you've got the adrenal cortex, or outer area. And they do secrete different hormones. So we're only interested in the middle part, the medulla here. And what happens is that the preganglionic neuron passes again spinal nerve through the white ramus, but notice it goes through the sympathetic trunk ganglia, doesn't connect there. It goes through what's called a collateral ganglia, specifically the celiac ganglia. Again, no synapse there, and this illustration didn't even draw the collateral ganglia. And then it finally terminates in the cells of the adrenal medulla. Now, the adrenal medulla produces epinephrine and norepinephrine. Hopefully you remember norepinephrine is a neurotransmitter. Well, in this case, though, epinephrine and norepinephrine are going to be hormones. They're going to be released from the adrenal medulla and travel through this capillary and have their effect as hormones instead. So where's the postganglionic neuron? Well, in this case, I want you to think of the adrenal medulla as basically modified postganglionic neurons. That is, in our development, the adrenal medulla was actually neural tissue that then formed into a gland instead of forming into neural tissue. So if you think of this, the preganglionic neuron is a neuron connected to postganglionic neurons that have now turned into a gland. Then it kind of makes sense of what it's doing, okay? So that's the one exception kind of to the pre and postganglionic neuron bit that we see with the sympathetic nervous system. So last thing we want to do then is look at the visceral reflex components. Again, this is very similar to somatic nervous system. We're going to have the same components involved, and of course, if we're going to make effects on blood pressure or calcium blood levels or sugar levels in our blood or anything else related to maintaining homeostasis, it's all going to be through reflexes, in this specifically visceral reflexes in this case. So we start out with the components. The first one, of course, is a sensory receptor. That's something out in the periphery that's able to pick up changes in some internal condition. Maybe it's blood glucose levels, maybe it's blood calcium levels, or blood pressure, or pH. Something to indicate that we're out of balance or away from homeostasis and need to effect a change. So that picks up the change. It sends impulses through the sensory fibers that travel through the dorsal root ganglion and then synapse with the third component, that is the integration center. Now this integration center may be the preganglionic neuron of the autonomic pathway, or it may be an interneuron, and then the interneuron would connect to the preganglionic neuron. In any case, from there it would travel through the motor pathway of the autonomic nervous system, or basically now we are in the autonomic nervous system. So we have the preganglionic axon and the postganglionic axon, and that then connects or sends the impulse to the last component of our reflex, and that's the effector. That is what we are acting on. And then if you remember, those effectors for visceral reflexes or the autonomic nervous system can only be cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, or glands. All right, so that concludes our video lecture on the anatomy of the autonomic nervous system. Next, we're going to, in the next video lecture, we'll look at the physiology of the autonomic nervous system, concentrating really on the differences that we see between the parasympathetic and sympathetic in much more detail and a little bit more biochemistry than we looked at already. So have a good rest of your day, and I look forward to the next video.